Ayubowan. On behalf of the Vishwaniketan International Peace and Meditation Center in Sri Lanka, we would like to welcome you all to episode 11 of A String of Pearls, a series of intergenerational dialogues. Vishwaniketan initiated this series to felicitate Dr. A.T. Aryaratne, who celebrated his 90th birthday on 5th November 2021. Today, we hold this episode of A String of Pearls on the theme Kindness and Resilience to celebrate the 63rd anniversary of the Sarvodaya Shramadana movement of Sri Lanka. Sarvodaya is the largest community development movement in Sri Lanka, founded by Dr. A.T. Aryaratne in 1958. Through this series, we intend to inspire and motivate present and future generations to open their hearts and minds to the pain and suffering of all life around them, and to take compassionate action to uplift and heal the lives of humans, animals, and the plant world. Now, I would like to introduce you to the distinguished speaker of today's dialogue. Vishwaniketan International Peace Center considers it as an honor and privilege to have a world-renowned scientist, Professor Richard Davidson, as our speaker. Professor Davidson is the William James and Vilas Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry and founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he has been a faculty member since 1984. Professor Davidson is also the founder of Healthy Minds Innovations, which translates science into tools to cultivate and measure well-being. He received his PhD from Harvard University in psychology, psychopathology, and psychophysiology, with a minor focus in behavioral neurology and neuroanatomy, and a BS in psychology from New York University. His research is broadly focused on the neural basis of emotion and emotional style, as well as methods to promote human flourishing, including meditation and related contemplative practices. His studies have centered on people across the lifespan from birth through old age. Professor Davidson is best known for his groundbreaking work studying emotion and the brain. A friend and confidante of the Dalai Lama, he is a highly sought after expert and speaker, leading conversations on well-being on international stages such as the World Economic Forum, where he serves on the Global Council on Mental Health. Time magazine named Professor Davidson one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2006. Professor Davidson has published hundreds of scientific papers and is the author with Sharon Begley of the New York Times bestseller, The Emotional Life of Your Brain. His new book, Altered Traits, was published in 2017 with close friend and colleague, Dr. Daniel Goleman, who graced this series of A String of Pearls a few months ago. Now I would like to introduce our two moderators, Tiara and Sanara. From a very young age, Tiara and Sanara have participated in 3S spiritual retreats, Searching the Self, Serving Society, and Saving the Environment. And Vishwaniketan is very fortunate to have them as moderators of this series, as they have been very much part and parcel of Vishwaniketan's journey. Tiara and Sanara have already started to contribute to social and environmental causes that they are passionate about. With this brief introduction, I would like to invite Tiara to commence the dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Charika, for that wonderful introduction. We're so glad to have you here today, Professor Davidson. How have you been doing?
I've been doing very well, thank you. I hope all is well with you in Sri Lanka.
Thank you so much for asking. We're doing great as well. Before we move on to our questions in today's dialogue, we would like to share a small video to commemorate the 63rd anniversary of Sarvodaya. Thank you so much for that video. Hope you all enjoyed it. Now I would like to invite Dr. Ari to share a few words about kindness and resilience with us today.
Well, I'm delighted that Professor Richard Davidson has taken his time off to join this program. And I'm sure that Tiara and Sanara will get the best out of Professor during the short time available. I would only say I'm so delighted and happy and thankful and grateful to him for joining our program, for which we have dedicated our lives, I think, my life for at least 75 years, long before the movement started. So, Professor Richard Davidson, I leave it to you to guide us and teach us as much as possible during this short period. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ari. Now I would like to commence the dialogue with our first question for today. In your journey as a neuroscientist, what inspired you to transition from studying adversities held by human mind to the more positive traits?
Well, thank you for that good question, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. And most importantly, thank you for the extraordinary work that you all are doing. It is so deeply inspiring, and I believe can serve as a model for many other parts of the world. This is so beneficial for not just Sri Lanka, but for the globe. So thank you so much. With regard to the question about what motivated the turning from adversity to virtue, we might say, it was a growing series of events, but most especially it was the intervention of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I first met him in 1992, and I had been involved personally with meditation for quite a number of years before that. I attended my first meditation retreat when I was a graduate student in 1974 in India with Goenka, who was my first teacher. I came back after that with a conviction that this was very important for Western science to investigate, but it was very clear that the science of the day and the culture around science was very closed at that point, narrow-minded. And it was made very clear to me that this is not, in those days, was not an acceptable and legitimate area of scientific inquiry. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama asked me very innocently why we could not use the same tools of modern science that we had been using to investigate adversity, to investigate stress and anxiety and depression and fear, why we couldn't use those same tools to study kindness and to study compassion. And I did not have a very good answer for His Holiness back in 1992, but it was the beginning of a wake-up call and an invitation to turn toward these more positive qualities. When we first began to study anxiety and stress, it was hard, but I think most scientists would agree that we've made progress. And so it occurred to me very clearly in that moment in 1992 that we really could do this for kindness and compassion. And I made a commitment to His Holiness on that day that I was going to do everything I possibly could to put kindness and compassion on the scientific map. And it's heartening to see the interest and progress that has occurred over these past 30 years. I think it would be fair to say that back in the 1990s, if you looked at textbooks of psychology or neuroscience, you would not see the word compassion in any of the index. And today, that really has changed. And so it's very heartening to see that these topics are now being embraced by modern science.
Thank you for that wonderful answer. I think, yes, it's important too that compassion and kindness was brought on the table as well, because I think we often get lost focusing on negative traits. So it's important for, as a human being, to understand that it's possible to be kind and to have compassion. And that area of study definitely opens various avenues, and it being incorporated in the West and then promoting practices such as meditation, I think help masses in the West. So I think that's interesting. And thank you so much for that answer.
Most welcome.
The next question we have for you, Professor, is that you've journeyed as deep as the mother's womb to understand the science of the human brain. In this regard, you have carried out extensive research into the baby brain, especially the impact of the expectant mother's mental health on the infant's brain development. What are the most vital findings that have emerged through all your research throughout the years?
Well, thank you so much, Sonara, for that really good question. And it is true that we have studied the fetal brain by studying mothers who are pregnant, and we have studied throughout the lifespan. And one of the important principles that lies beneath these studies is the notion of plasticity, neuroplasticity, and other forms of plasticity that I will mention in a moment. But this gives us a framework to understand how changes in practices, in contemplative practices, for example, that we can use to cultivate well-being and flourishing, how those practices can actually result in enduring changes. And so one of the reasons why we began to study the infant brain is because we know from modern scientific research that there are sensitive periods of development. And these sensitive periods of development are periods during which the brain is particularly susceptible to change, where the brain is especially plastic, we would say. It is capable of reorganization and of transformation during these periods in a way that is enhanced, if you will. And there are three sensitive periods of development in early life. And those three sensitive periods are around the time of birth, at the onset of schooling between roughly the ages of 4 and 7 years, and then around adolescence. Those are the three early sensitive periods of development. Now, one of the things that I want to remind viewers right at the beginning is that plasticity is present throughout life. And because there are these sensitive periods early in development, doesn't mean that plasticity ends in adolescence. It's still present throughout life. But these are periods during which interventions to cultivate flourishing may have an outsized influence, if you will. They may be particularly significant in their impact. And so one of these periods that's so exciting is in the womb itself, because we know that the demeanor of a mother, the emotions of a mother will actually impact the developing fetus. And that's kind of amazing. And we have studied that using rigorous scientific methods. And the way we study that is really, in principle, quite simple. We can recruit mothers while they are pregnant and follow them until they give birth to their babies. And at the time they give birth, we can take a blood sample from the umbilical cord, which is typically discarded at the time of birth. And we can obtain a blood sample from the umbilical cord, which provides us with a snapshot of the epigenetic status of the fetus. Now, what is epigenetics? Epigenetics is another kind of plasticity. It is the plasticity of our genome. And so we know that each of us is born with a sequence of base pairs, which is our DNA. And for the most part, that sequence will not change over the course of one's life. But what will change is the extent to which any given gene is turned on or turned off. We can think of genes having little volume controls that range from low to high. And that regulates the extent to which a gene is manufacturing the proteins for which it is designed. And it turns out that a mother's demeanor, her emotions, her well-being, all impact the developing fetus and influence the epigenetics that we can measure in the umbilical cord blood. And then when the babies are born, we put the babies in the scanner, which actually in the MRI scanner to scan their brain, which actually is quite easy because newborn babies sleep a lot. And so we can simply place them gently in the scanner when they're sleeping. And it turns out that that's quite easy to do. And we can get a picture of the baby's brain in this way, completely non-invasively, with absolutely no harm to the baby. And in this way, we can study the influence of the mother's demeanor. And so we're doing research now where we're teaching the mom some simple meditation practices to cultivate well-being during pregnancy. And we're examining the impact of those practices on the fetus with the hypothesis that as the mother cultivates more well-being through these practices, it will influence the neurodevelopment of the fetus in ways that will be measurable on these measures. And so this is something that we're quite excited about. You also asked about generally what I'm excited about these days in terms of new research. And let me just add one little tidbit here, and that is the possibility of scaling these practices to provide more and more people access to simple contemplative practices to cultivate well-being. One of the things the Dalai Lama reminds us of every time we're with him is that there are 7 billion people on the planet. And in order to really produce change in this world, we need to reach as many of these people as possible. And so we are interested these days in the real world being our laboratory, so to speak, and scaling these practices in ways that where we can provide access to many, many people, millions of people, and measure the impact of this kind of training of the mind on various social indicators that are really important to societies. Indicators such as life expectancy, the health of societies, the prevalence of mental illness, the suicide rates. All of these are metrics that we believe will change as a consequence of having more and more people engage in these simple practices. One of the things that I often remind people is that when human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And yet, my bet is that every person who is watching or listening to this brushes their teeth, typically a couple of times a day. Now, this is not part of our genome. This is a learned behavior. And we do it because we understand that it's important for our personal physical hygiene. And what we're talking about here is something important for our personal mental hygiene. And despite the importance of our teeth, I think many people would say that their minds are even more important than their teeth and their heart. And we can train the mind and the heart through these simple practices. And even if we spend as short a time as we spend each day brushing our teeth, nurturing our mind, I have the conviction that this world would be a different place.
That's wonderful to hear, Professor, about your new research and how you're planning to make it accessible to so many more people out there, because I think it's important, then you'll be able to measure change that takes place within the society better. So I think that's definitely going to be beneficial. And I could also relate to your explanation on how mindfulness is important during the period of pregnancy and promoting such holistic practices, because similarly they do conduct programs at Vishwaniketan that teaches pregnant mothers on mindfulness and holistic approach to childbirth and having a mindful delivery. I think it's important because in the absence of that, I've read up in different places that trauma can be passed genetically as well. So it's important to, I think, cultivate these holistic practices to ensure that that doesn't happen. So it's great that it's going to be accessible to a lot of people out there.
Thank you. And I should just add, since you brought up trauma and the possibility of transmitting trauma genetically or epigenetically, which is absolutely true, and there's very good evidence for that, it invites the possibility that there can also be the intergenerational transmission of resilience and the intergenerational transmission of awakening. The very same mechanisms that we know are transformed through trauma can also be harnessed for the good by cultivating these positive qualities. And so I think that the intergenerational transmission of these positive qualities is a really important topic that needs to be examined in modern scientific research.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's important for our listeners also to learn that. And I'm sure that they could also incorporate these holistic practices in their life. Moving on to our next question for today. You've taught the ABCs of brain science to even preschoolers. Why is it so important for us to learn about the workings of the human brain from a very young age?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking it. Well, I think that the understanding of the brain is helpful because it gives people the appreciation for the fact that our minds are not fixed because our brains can change. And so this enables us to more easily develop what some psychologists have called a growth mindset. A growth mindset is the adoption of the beliefs and the framework that we can change, that our minds can change. They're not fixed. And this is something really important. And so if the teaching of a little bit about the brain can help young children appreciate the fact that they can change, that would be a really good contribution, I think.
Thank you for that beautiful response, Professor. And I do believe that training children from a young age so that they can really understand how the human brain works, because we are the most developed of all living species. And for children to learn and appreciate that, I feel is really, really important. And with that, I would like to move on to the fourth question. You've constantly emphasized that well-being is a skill that we all need to nurture within ourselves. You've developed the kindness curricula for preschool children and the Healthy Minds app as well. What goals did you seek to achieve by creating both these tools to help both children and adults alike?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question and for recognizing those interventions and curricula that we've developed. Both of them are freely available, the Kindness Curriculum and the Healthy Minds program. Unfortunately, they're only available in English, but actually the Kindness Curriculum is also available in Spanish. But we have made the intentional decision to freely disseminate them to remove any kind of financial barrier in order to increase the likelihood that they will be more and more accessible. Our aspiration for the Healthy Minds program and the Kindness Curriculum is that they can be translated into many additional languages and made available throughout the world. It also provides an opportunity for us to study the impact of this kind of training. And so one of the exciting things about the Healthy Minds program, the app that we have freely released, is the possibility of studying the impact of training through this program in many different parts of the world. And that's actually something that we're doing today. It's being used now by more than 300,000 people in more than 100 different countries. And so it's exciting. And I believe that as more people learn about it, it will become more extensively used and provide an opportunity for us to study what impact it has in different segments of our societies. And so it also provides feedback for us to further enhance the program and to do one other thing which is important to mention, and that is one size. The scientific research shows that one size does not fit all. And so if we can do a better job of recommending to people based on an individual's own cognitive and emotional style, which is something that we can measure, if we can then recommend to people specific practices that might be particularly helpful to them as individuals, that would be really beneficial. Because the same program will benefit certain people a lot and other people less. And so if we can tailor our recommendations based on a person's cognitive and emotional style, we believe that we can actually be more effective. So this is something that is a topic for current scientific investigation.
That's wonderful to hear about the program, Professor. And I think it's important that the solution, especially when it comes to your own brain, is very individualized and tailored to fit your own requirements. So I think that's very interesting, and hopefully we'll be able to make such research accessible to a lot of people out there. Moving on to the next question I have today. As adolescents, we are curious to learn about cutting-edge scientific discoveries regarding the developing brain of children and young people and nurturing of a balanced and healthy mind in both children and adolescents.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you so much for asking that. By the way, how old are each of you?
I'm 17.
And I'm 16.
Wonderful. You're both remarkable women, and really appreciate your great questions. So as I mentioned earlier, adolescence is a sensitive period of development. It is a time when the brain undergoes tremendous reorganization. And one of the really challenging facts is that if you look over the course of the last 100 years, and if you look at the onset of puberty in different countries across the world, one of the kind of frightening facts is that puberty, the onset of puberty is occurring earlier and earlier. And over the last 100 years, there's been a dramatic shift in the age of onset of puberty. And so today, in certain countries in the developed world, in parts of the United States, there are adolescent girls who begin puberty at the age of 10, even earlier in certain groups. And yet the brain is on a different developmental trajectory. And there are certain systems of the brain that are especially important in regulation. For example, our capacity to regulate our emotions, that don't come online until very late adolescence, 18, 19, 20. And yet puberty is occurring earlier and earlier. And this is the first time in human history that we have this disparity between the onset of puberty and the development of regulatory systems in the brain. And this is, as you might imagine, a condition or a situation that can produce a lot of suffering, because it provides the causes and conditions for adolescents to make choices in the absence of having regulatory systems in the brain online, but choices that are driven by the hormonal changes that are occurring with early pubertal onset. So this is a huge issue. And I believe that there is a real opportunity with some simple contemplative practices, particularly some simple mindfulness awareness practices, and also some compassion practices, to teach these practices to adolescents in a way that will really make a difference and assist in promoting increased regulation at a time when it is so critically needed because of this widening disparity between the onset of puberty and the onset of the development of these brain systems. So this is a hugely important issue. Let me say one other thing about this. We know that in at least the developed world or the developing world, there are data available in many different parts of the world. I don't know about Sri Lanka, but many parts of the Western world that show that the prevalence of depression in boys and girls is equivalent before adolescence. And then once adolescence occurs, the rates of depression double in girls compared to boys, literally double. And this gender difference in depression is then present for the remainder of life. And this is true today in every Western country. And we know, according to the World Health Organization, that depression is the leading cause of morbidity worldwide. It exacts an enormous toll. And so I have the conviction that if we are able to teach young adolescents simple practices to cultivate awareness and connection, we will be able to reduce this gender disparity in depression and reduce the prevalence of depression in girls compared to boys so that we can decrease this ratio. And this is hugely important. And we also know, by the way, that the COVID-19 pandemic has only accentuated these problems. And in some countries, it's expressed as a frightening increase in the suicide rate among girls, teenage girls in particular. There are recent data, for example, that have been published just a few weeks ago from Japan, showing that the rates of teenage girls' suicide in Japan over the last 6 months during the COVID-19 pandemic has skyrocketed. It's just going up very steeply. And so this is a real crisis. And I believe that we have a moral obligation to do everything we can, particularly in teenagers, to help address this.
Thank you, Doctor, for that beautiful response. I agree with everything you said. And adolescence is the time period where we're still figuring everything out. We tend to make impulsive decisions that could end up in our downfall. And it's when we really don't know what we're doing ourselves. We're just figuring it out as we go. And I feel like awareness is the most important thing at this point, at such a rapidly developing world with society that's also developing with all the pressure and the other external factors that have an effect on our lives and our brains. I feel like awareness on what our brain can do and what our brain goes through during this very deciding period of our lives is really important. And again, from a very young age, bringing in awareness and educating young children and adolescents about how far one's brain can travel and how we can avoid things like depression and lean towards more positive aspects like kindness, resilience, through just day-to-day activities. And with that, I would like to move on to the final question we have for you today. At present, we are living through very challenging times, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic. You recently developed the COVID-19 Wellbeing Toolkit to help those who have found themselves in dark places during the past few years. It would be wonderful if you can share the key elements of these remarkable innovations you've done.
So, yeah, thank you so much. One of the things that we are increasingly recognizing is that in addition to the devastating impact on physical health that is caused by the COVID-19 virus, there is an accompanying impact on mental health. There was a paper recently published also just a few weeks ago in the British medical journal Lancet that presented data on the prevalence of anxiety and depression in 204 countries throughout the world. And it compared the rates before the pandemic and during the pandemic. And in every single country, all 204 countries, the rates during the pandemic are elevated for both depression and anxiety. They're elevated more in females compared to males. And in some countries, these rates are very dramatically elevated, more than 30% increases during the pandemic compared to before the pandemic. So this is a real crisis. And one of the strategies that we have been promoting is trying to meet people where they are. Having an unrealistic expectation of people meditating for hours a day is, that's not going to be helpful, we believe. It would be great if people can do that, but there's so much else going on in people's lives at this point that we have found that not to be realistic. But we've been working with different sectors of the community, including public school teachers who are teaching grades kindergarten through high school. We've worked with first responders, with people in the law enforcement and also fire, people in the fire department. We've worked with healthcare providers. And what we're doing with all these groups is providing them with access to really short practices that they can actually do while they're doing other activities of daily living. For example, while they're walking, while they're commuting, while they are cleaning their house. These are all opportunities for people to nurture their mind and their heart. And one of the things that we have found in working with some of these groups is that the purpose pillar of our framework for understanding well-being is particularly important. So to give one example, with public school teachers, one of the things we found is that many of these teachers reported that for the first time in a long time, they were able to remember why they became teachers in the first place. What was their motivation for becoming teachers, and that they really are dedicated to helping young children thrive, to help educate young children. And they rediscovered their purpose, which can provide a sense of vitality and a sense of engagement in the world. And this doesn't take a lot of practice. It's really reminding ourselves of the nature of our own mind, if you will. And so this has been really very, very helpful.
A small follow-up question I had, Professor, was I think on the lines where you said females are most likely to have higher levels of depressions as opposed to males. What are the reasons behind that?
Nobody knows definitively, but the likelihood is that it's mostly due to social and cultural factors that are differentially influencing young girls versus boys. In the West in particular, we have the social media expectations of how women should look and behave, all are contributors, I think, to the increased distress and depression that is taken on by girls compared to boys. We haven't really talked yet about social media, but just very briefly, one of the things I often say is that we are all participants in this grand experiment for which none of us have provided informed consent, because we're just exposed to this kind of media all the time. And so one of the important insights, I think, is that this is not going to change very quickly. And also, social media is one of those things over which we have very little control. But what we do have control over is our own mind. And so we can teach young children how to interact with this kind of media, how to change their relationship to this kind of media. And so they're not completely hijacked by it. And this, I think, will be helpful in decreasing the negative influences that these sources of information have.
I agree with you, Professor, because I think it's important to educate and equip young kids, because I think from a very young age, our generation is exposed to social media. And I personally do know a lot of friends who are going through tough times because of, peer pressure and societal pressure that comes through these social media platforms that just exaggerates that. So I think in a world where we're exposed from a very young age, that definitely takes a huge toll on our minds. So it's important for us to learn and to be equipped and be aware of the negative consequences, and also maybe reduce engaging in I think we do need to be on social media platforms, but to not make it a crucial part of our life as teenagers is very important. And I also do agree with you on how COVID-19 has affected all of us. And me personally, being indoors and not having human interactions with friends and family, definitely it's a tough time to go through as a teenager who want to go out there and socialize with a lot of people. So, and in addition to that, we lead very complex lives. We have Zoom meetings and online classes. So I think incorporating the little practices you said in the free times we have or in our day-to-day activities, so it doesn't feel like an additional burden we take upon ourselves, is, I think, an important take-home message to all young kids out there, and how they could incorporate that in their day-to-day lives in order to bring about the change necessary. So I would like to thank you, and we're coming to the end of our very interesting dialogue today. And I would like to personally thank you, Professor, for being with us here today and for engaging in such an enlightening dialogue with us that will definitely help a lot of young people out there that listen to this series. And now I would like to invite Dr. Charika to share some closing remarks.
Thank you, Tiara. I have no words to express how blessed we are to have you with us today, Professor. Through your research, you have been a teacher, a mentor, a guide to us in our work at Vishwaniketan. The scientific findings you have shared with us in your books, Train Your Mind and Change Your Brain, and Emotional Life of Your Brain, have constantly been referred to and shared in our programs. We haven't kept a track of the number of times we have shared short video clips of your talk, especially your analysis about the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex and how it affects the young adult's mind, the brain. So, but we have shared a lot of your teachings and your research findings among our participants to motivate and inspire them to practice meditation. We know that you have visited Sri Lanka and stayed for some time with the most venerable Nyanaponika Thera in Kandy. We sincerely hope that we will be blessed with an opportunity to meet with you in person here in Sri Lanka. On behalf of the Board of Trustees of the A.T. Aryaratna Charitable Trust, the governing body of Vishwaniketan, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to you for being with us today and sharing your groundbreaking research findings. I extend my thanks to Dr. Ari for being with us today and sharing some opening remarks in spite of your physical limitations. A very special word of thanks to Tiara and Sanara for beautifully moderating the event with such poise, eloquence, and confidence. It is important for me to remember with gratitude Max, who coordinated with me for months to make this dialogue a success. And my sincere thanks to Madhushan for designing the flyer and the videos for this particular dialogue. And I would like to also thank Mrs. Sushira Gunawardena for all her support and assistance. May all of you be well, happy, and peaceful. Thank you very much.
And thank you all so much. And I would like to express my gratitude for all that you are doing to promote kindness and equanimity and well-being on the planet today. I would like to thank Dr. Ari for your extraordinarily inspiring life example from which we all learn so much. And I want to end by saying that I feel a sense of deepest gratitude and optimism about the future because of Tiara and Sonara. The qualities that each of you embody gives me hope for the future of humanity. So may you all be happy and be healthy. And I very much wish to visit at some point Sri Lanka again and to meet with all of you in person. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.